All right, so today we're really diving into Nietzsche, like deep into the guy himself with this deep dive into the birth of tragedy. But we're not even starting with the book exactly, are we?
Not quite. We're actually starting with Nietzsche looking back at his own work. Years later, kind of like that feeling when you revisit something you created and you're like, oof, what was I thinking?
Yeah, totally. Like those old Facebook posts we all regret. Except, this is Nietzsche, and he holds nothing back.
Seriously, he calls his own book an impossible book. Poorly written, even embarrassing at times. Hard to imagine anyone else having the, well, audacity.
Talk about self-awareness, right? I mean, most people would just bury those early works, so why air your dirty laundry like that? What's the strategy there?
Right. It's kind of brilliant when you think about it. By acknowledging the flaws so openly, it's almost like he's inviting us into his thought process, showing us how his thinking has developed over time. I mean, he's not disowning the book entirely.
So he's saying, yeah, it's rough around the edges, but the core message is still fire.
That's kind of bold, honestly. It makes me even more interested to hear what he has to say.
Absolutely. And there's another layer here that we have to consider. Remember, Nietzsche wrote The Birth of Tragedy during a very specific historical moment, the Franco-Prussian War.
Oh, right, right. So he's writing against a backdrop of war, intense upheaval, uncertainty. That's definitely going to influence a thinker. It had to, right? I mean, imagine trying to grapple with the chaos and suffering of war firsthand. Makes you wonder, could exploring how the ancient Greeks found meaning in tragedy have been a way for Nietzsche to understand his own present?
Yeah, like searching for answers in the past to navigate the darkness of his own time. And speaking of the Greeks, that leads us perfectly into one of Nietzsche's most famous concepts, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. This is where things get really interesting.
Two opposing forces, but not just out there in the world. He saw them within us, expressed through art, and absolutely crucial to understanding how the Greeks saw the world.
Okay, for our listeners who might not be familiar, let's break down these two forces. So we've got the Apollonian, all about order, reason, beauty. Think like a beautifully crafted sculpture, perfectly proportioned.
Right, and then we have the Dionysian, which is like the opposite end of the spectrum. Wild, ecstatic energy, primal instincts. Less about thinking, more about feeling, more about losing yourself in something bigger. Like, picture a wild dance party fueled by something more.
It's like the difference between a carefully planned museum and a wild, ecstatic, totally improvised celebration. Both awesome in their own way, obviously.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that for Nietzsche, these weren't just like abstract ideas he came up with. He saw them reflected in everyday Greek life. Like
Huh?
it was just how they understood the world.
Give me an example. Help me step into that world a bit. What would it look like?
Okay, so imagine yourself at an ancient Greek festival, right? You're surrounded by the structured beauty of these incredible temples, all perfectly balanced, symbolizing that Apollonian ideal. But then
Yeah.
you're swept up in these ecstatic rituals dedicated to Dionysus. Music, dancing, a complete surrender to the senses. It's almost like they found a way to honor both sides.
So it's not just about logic and reason for the Greeks. They also understood the importance of letting go, of embracing that raw, instinctual part of ourselves.
Exactly. And Nietzsche believed that this unique combination was the very source of Greek tragedy, this tension, this pushing and pulling between these opposing forces.
So just to be clear, it wasn't just about sad stories.
No, not at all. It was about this collision between the Apollonian and the Dionysian playing out right there on stage.
Yeah.
The Apollonian giving form and structure to the raw, chaotic energy of the Dionysian.
So like the Dionysian is a wild horse, and the Apollonian is the skilled rider who can harness its power, create something truly extraordinary.
Love that analogy.
Huh.
And it's from this dynamic interplay, this fusion of order and chaos, reason and emotion, that Nietzsche believed Greek tragedy drew its power.
It's a fascinating perspective, but this is Nietzsche we're talking about. He's not afraid to stir the pot a bit, right? And I have a feeling a certain philosopher named Socrates might be about to enter the scene, and not necessarily in a good way.
You would be right. Nietzsche saw Socrates as a turning point in Western thought, but not for the better when it came to art, especially tragedy.
Uh-oh, here we go. So Socrates, the unexpected villain of our story. I gotta hear this.
Okay, before we paint Socrates as like the villain in all this, it's more nuanced than that. It's not that Nietzsche thought Socrates was a bad guy, more like he represented this shift in thinking, this emphasis on reason, on logic. And sometimes that came at the expense of those raw, like gut-level emotions.
So not that logic is bad,
Mm.
but maybe not the whole picture, especially when we're talking about art, which is practically all about emotion.
Exactly. Like you can understand something intellectually, right? Like a scientific fact. But that doesn't hit you the same way as a piece of music, or a truly moving performance.
Sure. Like knowing how a joke works versus actually finding it funny.
There you go.
Yeah.
And for Nietzsche, this Socratic thing, this hyper-focus on logic, on reason, it really had a huge impact. Changed the trajectory of Western thought, especially when it came to art.
Okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this. Too much emphasis on just the rational mind. What does that do to something like tragedy, which thrives on emotional intensity?
Well, Nietzsche would say it kind of killed it.
Wow, he really went there. But how did that happen exactly?
See, for Nietzsche, true tragedy needs that element of the irrational, the unexplainable, that Dionysian mystery we were talking about.
Yeah.
And Socrates, with his whole let's rationally explain everything approach, kind of,
Yeah.
well, he chipped away at that.
Like over-explaining a joke, it loses all its power.
Exactly. And you know what Nietzsche thought was a perfect example of this? Opera.
Opera, wait, but that's all passion, drama, huge emotions. How does that fit into this hyper-rationality thing?
That's what's so interesting, right? On the surface, opera, yeah, it's full of passion. But Nietzsche saw it as this prime example of the Socratic approach to art. Like it became more about entertainment, about these beautiful voices, spectacle, rather than those deeper mythic truths that fueled Greek tragedy.
So it's more concerned with the form, the technical side of things, than the raw emotional power.
You got it. And what's really wild is that Nietzsche saw this trend in opera, and he connected it to bigger cultural shifts happening back then.
So drawing a line from ancient Greece to his own time, maybe suggesting we're still dealing with this tension between the Apollonian and Dionysian today.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really relevant for us. Think about it. I mean, our world, obsessed with information, constant stimulation, analyzing everything to death. Have we gone too far down that road, lost touch with that primal energy? The Dionysian side, Nietzsche thought, was so important, not just for art, but for a good life.
It makes you think, so are we doomed then to live in a world ruled by the purely analytical?
Well, Nietzsche wasn't all doom and gloom. He saw hope, this way to reawaken that Dionysian spirit. And it came from a pretty unexpected place, German music.
German music, like Bach, Beethoven, Wagner, those guys. How does that fit into all of this?
Nietzsche thought German music, especially the composers you mentioned, it had this unique ability to tap into something deeper, beyond words, beyond logic.
It's like music can just bypass all the noise, all the mental chatter, and speak to something deeper in us. You get lost in the sound and suddenly nothing else matters.
Right. That feeling of being swept away completely, of experiencing something you just can't put into words. That's the power of the Dionysian that Nietzsche saw in German music.
It makes you wonder if that's why music has always been so universal. Every culture has it throughout history. It's a force that goes beyond all that.
It's a pretty compelling argument.
Yeah.
From ancient rituals to a sold-out concert today. Music has this incredible ability to connect us to something bigger than ourselves, to emotions we all share no matter what.
So if we're taking Nietzsche seriously here, and this Dionysian energy is so important for a good life, how do we tap into that? Is it as simple as just cranking up the Wagner?
I think it goes a little deeper than that. It's more about seeking out experiences that shake us up a bit, that break us out of those ruts, our routines, our usual ways of thinking and being, experiences that make us really feel something, connect us to something bigger.
So not just passive listening, we have to actively search for things that wake us up, that remind us of the power of art, the beauty in the world around us.
Exactly. Maybe it's a live concert, losing yourself in a dance performance, or even just being out in nature, really experiencing the raw beauty of it all. It's about those moments that remind us that we're really alive, the mystery, the wonder of being here.
Embracing the unknown, the unexpected, the stuff that challenges our comfy assumptions.
Exactly. And I think at its core, that's really what Nietzsche's getting at. It's not about rejecting reason entirely or trying to, go back to some idealized past. It's about balance, finding that way of being in the world that honors both sides, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the rational and the instinctual, order and chaos. It's all part of it.
Embracing the full spectrum of human experience, really. Recognizing that both sides, the light and the shadow, make us who we are.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And maybe if we can find that balance within ourselves, it allows us to create new things, new art, new ways of living that capture the full richness of what it means to be human.
Now, that is a thought to carry with us. So, wrapping up our deep dive into Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, this is way more than just some old philosophy book, right? It's a challenge to really examine our own lives, to rediscover the power of art, to embrace everything about the human experience.
It's a good reminder that even in this world where everything's about reason, technology, there's still room for passion, for mystery, for those moments that remind us how beautiful, how strange life really is.
I love it. Music to my ears, literally. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Go forth, explore those Dionysian depths, and let the music move you.